Welcome back. So we're going to take a second now and talk about validation with Mongoose. So we're going to just focus on the Freddy example right now. So this is the same thing we had before. His name is Freddy, favorite toy is Bone, age is 2. And note that all of this information directly matches what we had before inside of our schema. So let's see what happens if we decide to change some of these things. So if I were, instead of calling this name, if I were to go ahead and call this like nickname, which isn't previously in our schema. So there's two things going on here, right? This means that I'm trying to add an attribute that wasn't declared in the schema, and I'm also ignoring an attribute that was declared in the schema. So do y'all think this is going to work? Take a second to think about it here while I write a little bit more code, and we will get back. Alright, so I just wrote some code here that is going to try to save this new Freddy object that we have, and it's going to print out the result of our saved object, or it's going to print out an error if it throws an error. And hopefully you took a second here to think about whether or not it would throw an error, since we're trying to insert an attribute that is not in the schema, and we're also ignoring an attribute that is in the schema. So I'm going to click save now, and it's going to rerun here in my NodeMon, and we'll see what prints out. Okay, so what we see is that we actually got result, which means that we did not get an error, and we're seeing that the Freddy object does not have a name attribute, but it also does not have a nickname attribute. So that means that what Mongoose did is it considered the data that we sent it, but because some of it did not match our schema, it disqualified that data, which is why nickname is not a value. And even though we had name in our schema, it went ahead and created our object without a name attribute. So this is alright sometimes, but there might be instances where we don't want something to be saved in the database if an attribute is missing, right? That's pretty typical. So let's go ahead and see what tools we have in Mongoose to make that happen. And the name of the game is really validation. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this save function so that we don't accidentally create a bunch of Freddys in the database. But let's go ahead and try this. So for our name function here, instead of just passing in the type as string, I'm going to switch it up a little bit, and we're going to pass in an object here. And so this object is going to take a couple different values. It's going to take a type, which you guessed it, is string, but it's also going to take in another one, and that's required. And we're going to make that true. Okay, so now we have this. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to leave the nickname field here, and we're going to go ahead and see what happens now that we changed name to be a required field. So I'm going to uncomment our save, run it, and you're going to see we got what is probably your first Mongoose error. And I'm going to pull this out so you can see it a little bit better. What we're seeing is a validation error. Dog validation failed, name is required. And so you're going to see here more details about the error that came up. So essentially, Mongoose got mad at us because we did not send a name even though a name is required. So the save failed. And it's important to notice that it actually is coming from this catch block and not from the then block. You can tell that over here because it says arrow first, which is coming from this text right there. So we saw here now that when we have required on a field, we will not be able to save it if it is not in fact present. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to comment out our save block one more time here so we can do a little bit more work. And I'm going to just, for the sake of time now, I'm going to give Freddy his name back. And we're going to talk about another aspect inside of validation. So let's go ahead and let's play with our age here for a second. So let's make this a type. And then we're actually going to pass in one more thing here. When we have a attribute of type number, Mongoose has a couple built-in validators for us in addition to the required one. So I'm going to go ahead and make this required. just because it's good practice. But also, I want to go ahead and give an age a minimum because I don't want to own a dog unless he's already 1 year old. And I'm also going to go ahead and give it a maximum. I'm not going to own any dogs that are more than 5 years old. So in this example, we're going to see what happens when we start playing with these constraints. So I'm going to make Freddy's age actually -1. And let's uncomment the save statement here and let's see what we get. Alright, we see that we actually got another error. I'll pull this back out. And we see dog validation failed, age -1 is less than the minimum allowed value of 1. And so if we change this to say 6, you'll see we get another error because the dog validation failed, path age is more than the maximum allowed value. Let me go ahead and bring this over. Awesome. So what about if we put something right on the boundary, like is 5, is that going to work? And the answer is in fact that it does work because maximum is inclusive, also minimum is inclusive. So that goes ahead and that saves our dog. Now, just another thing to be aware of, in addition to having these kind of built-in things for numbers, there's also some built-ins for strings. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new thing, a new property for our dogs, and let's call them, let's give it a type. So dogs should have a type, you know, a breed. Actually, let's change this to breed. And so the type here is going to be string, and we're actually going to pass in something new this time. We're going to pass in an enum. So I only want to own one of 2 breeds. I either want a lab or I want a poodle. And so we're going to see here that we're going to have errors if we try to pass in something that does not match this. Let's give this a try. I want my breed. Let's just test it out, and let's say a pug. So remember, a pug is not one of the things that I specified in my enum. So let's go ahead here and we're going to see what happens when I uncomment the save when Mongoose receives that. And we're going to see, again, we're getting an error. Dog validation failed. Breed pug is not a valid enum. So I think you're probably getting the point by now. If I change this to say lab, we'll see that it works. Alright, just a couple other notes for the strings. They also have a min length and a max length validator, which I'm not going to demonstrate in this case, but just it's good to know that it's there. Another thing that is really key about Mongoose that I want to highlight at this point in time is that in this last moment, I just went ahead and added a new field to our schema, our breed. But if we go ahead and we look at all the past items that are in our database, maybe it'll be easier to do over here. When we look, a lot of these old dogs, Ralph and Spots, they don't have breeds, right? Because this is from our old schema before we added breed. But Mongoose is okay with that. Our schema evolved, but because it's not a rigid schema like in a SQL database, it's okay if not all the documents in a collection adhere to the same schema. But Mongoose is going to enforce this from this point forward in the sense that when we create new objects with this schema that's properly reflected, it will allow us to add breed, and it's going to work just like we expect it to. Okay, that's it. We have now talked about how to add things to our schemas after their initial creation, as well as validation, which are really big and important parts of working with Mongoose.